Every food rule you follow has an origin story. Almost none of them are science. I want you to think about where you're listening to this right now. Maybe you're in bed, lights dimmed, trying to wind down after a day spent making food decisions you thought were responsible. Maybe you're in your car, commuting home, replaying the moment you chose the salad with fat-free dressing because that felt like the right choice. Maybe you're folding laundry, washing dishes, or staring at your ceiling, and somewhere in the back of your mind sits a quiet inventory of everything you ate today and whether it measured up. Here's what I want you to do. Down in the comments, type any topic you want me to talk about next. Anything. Historical events, strange traditions, forgotten industries, cultural myths, whatever keeps you curious at night. I read them all. This channel exists because you keep showing up, and I want to know what pulls you in. Be specific. Be weird. I'm here for it. But tonight, we're talking about food. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something that's going to sit uncomfortably for the next few hours. The food rules you inherited, the ones you repeat to yourself while standing in the grocery aisle, the ones you use to justify skipping dessert, or buying the organic version, or throwing away the egg yolk, most of them aren't based on biology. They're based on marketing campaigns, industrial convenience, misread studies, and cultural anxiety that got dressed up as science and walked into your kitchen unopposed. You've been told since childhood that eating fat makes you fat. And you believed it because it sounds logical, because it rhymes almost, and because an entire industry spent decades making sure you never questioned it. You were told breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and that claim didn't come from a hospital, it came from a cereal factory. You were told to drink 8 glasses of water daily, and the actual recommendation you think you're following included a second sentence nobody ever repeated. You were told carrots improve your night vision. And the story traces back to World War II propaganda designed to hide British radar technology from the Germans. Every single one of these rules feels like common sense now. That's the problem. They've been repeated so many times, by so many people, in so many contexts, that they stopped sounding like claims and started sounding like facts. Your parents told you. Your doctor mentioned it. The magazine at the checkout stand confirmed it, and so you started living like it was true, and at some point, you stopped asking if it ever was. Here's the shape of what's coming. Over the next 3 hours, we're going to dismantle 45 of these rules. Not with outrage, not with conspiracy, but with the actual science, the actual history, and the actual industrial timeline that created them. Some of them were innocent misunderstandings. Some were deliberate distortions. Some were good ideas taken too far. And some were just marketing slogans that escaped the advertisement and became nutritional gospel. This isn't about making you angry, it's about making you curious, because once you see how these beliefs were constructed, you start noticing the machinery everywhere. You start asking better questions, you stop treating food like a moral test you're constantly failing, and start treating it like fuel, culture, pleasure, and biology all at once, which is what it's always been. We're going to move slowly. We're going to move carefully. And by the time you wake up tomorrow, or the time you finish this tonight if you make it that far, you're going to understand that the guilt you've been carrying about food was never yours to begin with. Someone handed it to you. Someone profited from it. And tonight, you're putting it down. The first lie is the one that probably shaped your entire relationship with fat. Let's start there. You've been told since childhood that eating fat makes you fat. The logic seemed airtight. The word is right there in both places. Dietary fat becomes body fat. It was easy to remember, easy to teach, and easy to sell. And for over 30 years, that belief governed public health policy, reshaped the food supply, and convinced an entire generation to eat in a way that made them sicker. Here's what actually happened. In the 1950s, a researcher named Ancel Keys published what became one of the most influential nutrition studies of the 20th century. It was called the 7 Countries Study, and it linked saturated fat consumption to heart disease. The results looked clear. The countries eating more fat had more heart disease. The relationship appeared direct, measurable, and alarming. The problem, the one that took decades to fully surface, was that Keys started with data from 22 countries and only used 7. The nations eating high-fat diets with low heart disease rates, places like France and Switzerland, were quietly left out of the analysis. The data that didn't fit the hypothesis didn't make it into the conclusion. and the conclusion became policy. By the 1980s, the war on fat was official. Dietary guidelines in the United States and across Europe told people to reduce fat intake, particularly saturated fat, to protect their hearts. The food industry, which had spent decades engineering products around fat for flavor, faced a serious problem. Fat makes food taste good. Without it, everything tasted like cardboard. So they did what any industry does when the rules change. They adapted. They replaced the fat with something else: refined sugar, processed starch, anything that would restore palatability and keep people buying. Low-fat yogurt appeared on shelves, sweetened with enough sugar to qualify as dessert. Fat-free cookies arrived, held together with corn syrup and modified food starch. Reduced-fat salad dressings, snack bars, frozen meals, all of them engineered to remove fat and replace it with the ingredients that actually drive weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. And you, trying to do the right thing, switched to all of it. You bought the low-fat yogurt. You ate the fat-free cookies. You poured the reduced-fat dressing on your salad and felt like you were making progress. You were following the guidelines. You were protecting your heart. You were being responsible. But your body still needed fat. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble, meaning without dietary fat, you can eat vegetables all day and still develop deficiencies, because your body cannot absorb those nutrients without fat present. Fat is required for hormone production, brain function, cell membrane integrity, and nutrient transport. It's not optional. It's not decorative. It's structural. And here's the part that should make you pause. Multiple large cohort studies conducted after the low-fat era found that full-fat dairy consumers showed equal or lower obesity rates compared to low-fat dairy consumers. The exact opposite of what the myth predicts. The people eating the butter, the whole milk, the full-fat cheese, they weren't heavier. In many cases, they were leaner. Your body stores excess calories as fat regardless of where those calories came from. Fat, carbohydrates, protein, it doesn't matter. The macronutrient was never the mechanism. The mechanism was and has always been total caloric intake relative to expenditure. You spent 30 years blaming the butter while the sugar sat right next to it, completely untouched, driving the actual problem. The low-fat movement didn't make people thinner. It made them hungrier. Because fat increases satiety. It slows gastric emptying. It signals your brain that you've eaten something substantial. When you remove it and replace it with refined carbohydrates, you return to hunger faster, you eat more frequently, and you consume more total calories across the day without ever feeling satisfied. The food industry understood this. They didn't need you to feel full, they needed you to keep eating. And the guidelines gave them permission to engineer a food supply that accomplished exactly that, all while carrying the implicit endorsement of public health authorities who told you this was the safer choice. The fat-free era coincided almost perfectly with the rise in obesity rates across developed nations. The more people followed the advice, the worse the outcomes became. And for years, the explanation offered was that people simply weren't following the advice hard enough, that they were cheating, sneaking fat, failing to comply. The possibility that the advice itself was wrong took decades to even enter the conversation. It's been revised now, quietly, without the fanfare that accompanied the original guidelines. Current nutritional science acknowledges that dietary fat, including saturated fat, is not the cardiovascular villain it was made out to be. The relationship is more complicated. The context matters. The food matrix matters, and the replacement matters most of all. But the belief is still out there. It's still in your head. You still feel a little guilty reaching for the full-fat version of anything, even though the science moved on years ago. That's how deep this went. It wasn't just policy. It became identity, and identity doesn't update as quickly as evidence does. You were lied to, not with malice necessarily, but with certainty that wasn't earned, and the consequences of that certainty reshaped your entire food supply, your metabolism, and your understanding of what it means to eat well. The butter was never your enemy. The industry that told you it was, that's where the story starts. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You've heard that phrase so many times it doesn't even register as a claim anymore. It sounds like a fact. It sounds like medicine. It sounds like something a doctor would say, something your grandmother believed, something carved into the foundation of how civilized people are supposed to start their morning. It's none of those things. It's a marketing slogan. And the men who wrote it owned cereal factories. Let me take you back to the early 20th century, to a moment when the American breakfast table looked nothing like it does now. People ate what was available. Leftovers from dinner, bread, eggs if they had chickens, cold meat if they had money. There was no cultural script that said you had to eat in the morning, no anxiety around skipping it, no medical consensus that missing breakfast was dangerous. Eating patterns were practical, regional, and shaped by labor demands, not by nutritional philosophy. Then came the grain-based breakfast industry, and with it, a problem. How do you sell a product that nobody thinks they need? You create the need. You build a narrative that transforms your product from an option into a biological requirement. And you do it so well that 3 generations later, people are still repeating your slogan without knowing where it came from. James Caleb Jackson invented granula in the 1860s, one of the first manufactured breakfast cereals. John Harvey Kellogg, running a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, developed cornflakes in the 1890s, initially as a bland, healthy food for his patients. His brother, Will Keith Kellogg, saw the commercial potential and turned it into an empire. These were not nutritionists, they were not researchers, they were manufacturers who needed a reason for their product to exist in a culture that had not historically treated morning eating as obligatory. The narrative they built was brilliant. Breakfast became the meal that set the tone for your entire day. Miss it, and your body suffers. Your mind slows. Your energy collapses. Children who skip breakfast can't learn. Adults who skip breakfast can't work. The message was everywhere. In advertisements, in magazines, in educational materials distributed to schools. A 1917 article in Good Health magazine, co-edited by Kellogg himself, was among the earliest publications to frame a missed breakfast as a medical risk, not a preference. Not a convenience, a risk, that's the origin. Not a double-blind clinical trial, not a longitudinal study, a cereal company's house publication. And it worked. By the mid-20th century, breakfast had become morally loaded. Skipping it wasn't just unwise, it was irresponsible. It marked you as someone who didn't care about your health, your productivity, your family. The belief didn't spread because the evidence was overwhelming. It spread because the repetition was overwhelming. Now let's talk about what your body is actually doing in the morning. Your liver stores glycogen, a readily available fuel source that powers normal brain function for several hours after waking, without any food intake. For most healthy adults, there is no physiological emergency happening between the hours of 7 and 9 in the morning. Your brain is not starving. Your metabolism is not collapsing. Your body is running on reserves it built specifically for this purpose. Randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of nutritional research, have found no significant metabolic advantage to eating breakfast for adults who are not hungry in the morning. Intermittent fasting protocols, the majority of which skip breakfast entirely, have shown documented benefits for insulin sensitivity, body composition, and cellular repair processes in multiple clinical studies. The argument that your metabolism needs to be activated by food in the morning has no basis in how metabolism actually works. Your metabolism runs continuously. It doesn't need a wake-up call. The claim that breakfast boosts children's school performance is real, but it's also confounded in ways the original research didn't fully account for. Children who eat breakfast regularly tend to also have more stable home environments, better sleep schedules, more consistent parental supervision, and better overall nutrition across the entire day. When researchers try to isolate breakfast as the single variable producing improved academic outcomes, the effect becomes much smaller and much less clear. The breakfast itself is often not the isolated variable producing the result. It's a marker of something else entirely. Your body does not have an 8 a.m. metabolic deadline. It does not penalize you for waiting until you're actually hungry to eat. The most important meal of the day is whichever one actually makes you feel functional, and that answer varies by person, by schedule, by activity level, by preference. That answer was always available for free. The cereal aisle just got there first. The familiar version, the one you inherited, says breakfast is non-negotiable. The reality says breakfast is a meal, and whether you eat it or not should be determined by hunger, schedule, and personal preference, not by a slogan written to move product off a shelf. You weren't given nutritional guidance. You were given a 100-year-old advertisement that never disclosed itself. 8 glasses of water a day. Non-negotiable. Miss one and your organs are apparently on the verge of something terrible. You've heard this number so many times it feels like physiology. It feels like a measurement your body came with, a threshold built into your cells, a requirement as fundamental as oxygen. It's not. It's a misreading of a 1945 recommendation from the U.S. Food and Nutrition Board, and the part everyone remembers is only half the sentence. Let me show you where this actually started. In 1945, the Food and Nutrition Board issued a report stating that adults need approximately 2.5 liters of water daily. That's roughly 8 glasses, depending on the size of your glass. The number entered public consciousness immediately. It was simple. It was specific. It was easy to remember and easy to repeat. But that recommendation had a second sentence. Almost no one read it. Almost no one repeated it. And almost no one remembers it now. That second sentence clarified that the majority of this quantity is contained in prepared foods, in your vegetables, in your fruit, in your soup, in your coffee, in everything you consume throughout the day that contains water, which is nearly everything. The number was never a prescription to drink 8 separate glasses of plain water. It was a total fluid intake estimate that included all sources. But the clarification was dropped. The number survived, and here you are, counting glasses, carrying a water bottle like a talisman, feeling vaguely guilty every time you realize you're only on glass number 4 by mid-afternoon. Let's talk about what hydration actually requires. Your body is approximately 60% water by weight. That water is in constant flux. You lose it through breathing, sweating, urination, and even just sitting still. You need to replace it. That part is not in dispute. The dispute is over whether there's a universal daily number that applies to all humans in all conditions, doing all activities. Hydration needs vary enormously based on body size, activity level, climate, diet composition, and individual kidney function. A universal number applied to 8 billion biologically distinct people living in different environments eating different foods is not science. It's a placeholder that escaped the laboratory and became doctrine. A person running a marathon in July has different hydration needs than someone sitting in an air-conditioned office in March. A person eating a diet high in fruits and vegetables is getting significant water from food. A person eating a diet high in dried and processed foods is not. The 8-glass rule doesn't account for any of this. It assumes a uniformity that doesn't exist. Here's what most people don't realize. Cucumbers are 96% water. Watermelon is 92%. Strawberries are 91%. Lettuce, celery, tomatoes, zucchini, all of them are delivering water with every bite. A diet with significant produce can account for 20 to 30% of total daily fluid needs before you've touched a glass. You're hydrating while you eat, and it counts, even though the 8-glass rule never mentions it. Coffee and tea, long accused of dehydrating you, have been shown in research to contribute positively to net fluid intake. The mild diuretic effect of caffeine does not offset the volume of water consumed in the beverage. You're not undoing your hydration by drinking coffee. You're adding to it. The belief that coffee doesn't count has kept people from acknowledging a significant portion of their actual daily water intake. And here's the part that should end this entire conversation. Your kidneys regulate hydration with extraordinary precision. They concentrate urine when you're low on water. They dilute it when you're adequately hydrated. They adjust output continuously based on input, activity, and environmental conditions. This system has been functioning in humans for hundreds of thousands of years, without anyone counting glasses. Your body also built a warning system for dehydration. It activates well before any meaningful physiological problem occurs. It's called thirst. It's reliable. It's immediate. And it's been guiding fluid intake since long before anyone invented the 8-glass rule. Thirst is not a late-stage warning. It's an early, functional signal that tells you to drink before any deficit becomes problematic. Ignoring thirst and drinking on a schedule is like ignoring hunger and eating by the clock. It works for some people in some contexts, but it's not a biological requirement. The origin of the 8-glass rule was an estimate of total daily water needs that included all sources. Somewhere along the way, the context was stripped. The number was isolated, and an entire industry grew up around selling you bottles, apps, reminders, and guilt. You've been carrying water like it's a medical device, tracking intake like it's medication, and worrying about hydration like it's a condition you're managing. Your body knew what to do the entire time. The rule that made you doubt it came from a sentence that was never finished. Eat your carrots and you'll see better in the dark. A piece of nutritional advice so thoroughly embedded in parenting culture that questioning it feels almost impolite. It's the kind of thing mothers say while serving dinner, the kind of thing children hear and believe without resistance, because it comes wrapped in care, in tradition, in the unmistakable tone of something that must be true, because everyone says it. Here's the actual origin. It was wartime propaganda, and it wasn't about nutrition at all. Let me take you to Britain during World War II. The Royal Air Force had developed airborne radar technology, a significant and secret advancement that dramatically improved their ability to intercept German bombers at night. British pilots were suddenly inexplicably effective after dark. They were finding enemy aircraft in conditions where visibility should have made that nearly impossible, and German intelligence wanted to know why. The British needed a cover story, something plausible, something that would explain the results without revealing the technology. So they constructed one. They attributed the RAF's night accuracy to a diet rich in carrots. The story was released to the press. The public believed it, and the British Ministry of Food, seeing an opportunity, ran domestic campaigns encouraging civilians to eat more carrots. Partly to reinforce the cover story, partly because wartime sugar rationing had created a significant carrot surplus that needed to be moved through the food system. The government had carrots, the public needed a reason to eat them, and the propaganda served both purposes beautifully. The campaigns worked so well that the belief survived the war, crossed borders, and became one of the most enduring pieces of nutritional folklore in the English-speaking world. Generations of children have been told to eat their carrots for their eyesight, and not one of those children was told they were repeating a lie invented to hide radar. Now let's talk about what carrots actually do. Vitamin A, which your body synthesizes from beta-carotene in carrots, is genuinely essential for producing rhodopsin, the photopigment used by rod cells for low-light vision. If you have a vitamin A deficiency, correcting it will improve your night vision. That is a real and documented effect. The research supports it. The biology is clear. The problem is that vitamin A deficiency is exceptionally rare in developed nations with varied food access. The overwhelming majority of people eating a normal diet, even a mediocre one, have more than sufficient retinol for full rhodopsin production. Consuming additional beta-carotene beyond what your body already needs produces no additional visual benefit. The excess is stored in your liver and fat tissue, or it's excreted. You will not see further, you will not see more clearly. You will just have eaten more carrots. Eating enormous quantities of them can turn your skin temporarily orange, a harmless condition called carotenemia that results from beta-carotene deposits in the skin. It's visible. It's reversible, and it still will not help you find anything in a dark room. Here's what makes this story worth understanding. The belief didn't spread because the evidence was strong. It spread because the repetition was strong. The British government had institutional authority. The press amplified the message, parents repeated it, and children, having no reason to doubt it, grew up and repeated it to their own children. The propaganda became culture, the culture became truth, and the truth was never questioned because it sounded reasonable enough to survive without scrutiny. This is how power reshapes food. Not always through conspiracy, not always through malice, sometimes through convenience, through wartime necessity, through industrial surplus, through the need to move product, manage resources, or protect strategic advantage. The story gets told, the story gets repeated, and eventually, the story becomes the thing people believe about their own bodies. You were told carrots improve your night vision, and you believed it, because the institution that told you had credibility. The Royal Air Force had credibility. The Ministry of Food had credibility. Your parents had credibility. And none of them knew they were repeating a cover story for radar technology. The vitamin A part is real. The improved night vision part is real if you're deficient. But the idea that eating more carrots will make you see better in the dark, the idea that carrots hold some special power over your vision that other foods do not, that part is a fabrication that outlived the war it was designed to win. Power didn't need to convince you forever. It just needed to convince you long enough for the belief to take root. And once it did, you kept it alive without any help. Let me take you inside an ordinary kitchen in the 1980s. A mother is standing at the counter. unpacking groceries. She's reading labels now, something she didn't used to do. Fat-free yogurt, low-fat milk, reduced fat cheese. She's loading them into the refrigerator with a quiet sense of accomplishment, the feeling of someone who's finally doing something right. Her children are at the table. One of them asks why the yogurt tastes different now. She tells them it's healthier this way. The fat was making them sick. The doctor said so. The news said so. The yogurt container itself says so. Right there on the front in bold letters. Fat-free. Like a badge. Like a promise. She doesn't know that the yogurt now contains more sugar than a candy bar. She doesn't know that the fat she removed was helping her children absorb vitamins from the vegetables she serves with dinner. She doesn't know that in 10 years, studies will start showing that the people who kept eating full-fat dairy stayed leaner than the people who switched. She doesn't know any of this because the information she has access to, the information being given to her by authorities she trusts, is telling her the opposite. Her husband comes home from work and opens the refrigerator. He's looking for something to eat before dinner. He sees the fat-free cookies she bought, the ones that taste like cardboard even though the box promised they wouldn't. He eats 4 of them and still feels hungry. He doesn't realize that the fat that used to be in those cookies was what made 2 of them feel like enough. He just thinks he has no self-control. This is what it felt like to live through the low-fat era, not as a statistic, not as a study, but as a person trying to feed a family, trying to stay healthy, trying to do the responsible thing with the information available. The guilt was everywhere. In the grocery store, in the doctor's office, in the mirror. You looked at your body and wondered what you were doing wrong because you were following all the rules and the results weren't coming. The food industry had reformulated everything. Crackers, salad dressing, ice cream, frozen dinners. Anything that used to contain fat now had a low-fat version, and that version sat on the shelf at eye level, highlighted, promoted, implicitly endorsed. The full-fat version was still there, but it was pushed to the side, priced the same or higher, and wrapped in the faint shame of being the old way, the irresponsible way, the way people ate before they knew better. Except they did know better, or their bodies did, because every time someone switched to the low-fat version of a food they used to enjoy, they noticed the same thing. They were hungrier an hour later. They were thinking about food more often. They were snacking between meals in a way they didn't used to. And they blamed themselves for it, because the advice they were following told them that hunger was a moral failing, not a biological response to eating food that didn't satisfy. Let me take you to the cereal aisle now, in the early 1900s, back when breakfast was still just a meal and not a cultural mandate. There's a man standing there, looking at a box of cornflakes. The box says, "This is what healthy people eat in the morning." It says children who eat this will do better in school. It says adults who eat this will have more energy, more focus, more capacity to meet the demands of the day. He believes it, because why wouldn't he? The box is clean, the branding is professional, the claims sound medical, and the man who made this cereal runs a sanitarium, a place where people go to get well. Surely he knows what he's talking about. What this man doesn't see is the factory behind the claim, the machinery turning corn into flakes, the logistics of moving product across the country, the advertising budget being spent to make sure every household in America hears the same message at the same time. He doesn't see the business model. He just sees the box, and the box is speaking to him in the language of health. His children eat the cereal. They like it. It's sweet, even though it's marketed as plain. They ask for it again the next morning, and the morning after that. Within a month, it's a habit. Within a year, it's tradition. And 20 years later, when those children are raising children of their own, they'll serve them the same cereal and tell them the same thing. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You have to eat something before school. This is what responsible parents do. None of them will remember that the phrase came from a cereal box. It will just feel true. Let's go back to the 1940s now, to a woman reading a government pamphlet about nutrition. The pamphlet says adults need 8 glasses of water a day. It's specific. It's clear. It's printed on official letterhead with the seal of a federal agency. She takes it seriously. She starts counting her glasses. She reminds her husband to drink more. She serves water with every meal and keeps a pitcher on the counter. She's doing exactly what the pamphlet recommended, except she's not, because she didn't read the second sentence. The one that said most of that water comes from food. The one that meant she was already meeting her hydration needs through soup, fruit, vegetables, coffee, and everything else she was eating throughout the day. But that sentence wasn't in the version she saw, or it was there, and she skimmed past it. Or it was there and it didn't stick, because the number was so much easier to remember. 8 glasses. Simple, concrete, measurable. She spends the rest of her life carrying that number in her head. She teaches it to her children. And her children, who never saw the original pamphlet, teach it to their children. The context disappears. The number remains. And 3 generations later, people are buying water bottles with measurement markers on the side, tracking their intake like it's medication, and feeling anxious if they fall short of a goal that was never meant to be a goal in the first place. This is what daily life looked like for people trying to make sense of food advice that came from institutions they trusted. They didn't have access to the studies. They didn't have access to the industry documents. They didn't have the internet to cross-reference claims or find dissenting opinions. They had the label. They had the pamphlet. They had the doctor's offhand comment during a checkup, and they built their lives around it. The guilt was real. The confusion was real. The sense that you were failing at something basic, something everyone else seemed to understand, that was real too. And it wasn't your fault. You were working with incomplete information, shaped by interests you couldn't see, delivered by authorities who didn't always know they were wrong. The woman in the kitchen unpacking low-fat groceries. The man in the cereal aisle reading the box. The mother counting water glasses and worrying she's not drinking enough. These weren't stupid people. They weren't careless people. They were people living inside a story they didn't write, trying to do their best with the information they had. And the information was a product. It was always a product. Let's talk about the egg yolk, that small, yellow circle at the center of an egg. For decades, it was treated like a tiny grenade, something dangerous, something you were supposed to remove and discard if you cared about your health, if you wanted to protect your heart, if you were serious about living a long life. The egg white was safe. The egg white was pure protein, harmless and virtuous. But the yolk, that was where the cholesterol lived. And cholesterol, you were told, was the enemy. Here's how this object became a symbol. In the mid-20th century, the cholesterol hypothesis took hold. The idea was simple and seemed logical. Dietary cholesterol raises blood cholesterol. Blood cholesterol clogs arteries. Clogged arteries cause heart attacks. Therefore, eating cholesterol causes heart attacks. Eggs contain cholesterol. A single egg yolk has about 185 milligrams of it. That number sat on the nutrition label like a warning. And for anyone trying to follow the guidelines, trying to keep their cholesterol intake below 300 milligrams per day as recommended, one egg yolk took up more than half the budget. So people stopped eating them. They separated the eggs. They poured the yolk down the drain. They ordered egg white omelets at restaurants and felt virtuous doing it. The yolk became a symbol of everything dangerous about food. Rich, indulgent, reckless. What they didn't know, what the guidelines didn't adequately communicate, was that your liver produces cholesterol endogenously. Your body makes it, regardless of what you eat. And when you consume more dietary cholesterol, your liver compensates by producing less. This process, called downregulation, means that for most people, dietary cholesterol from eggs has minimal impact on circulating blood cholesterol levels. The science on this became clearer over time. Studies started showing that eggs didn't raise cholesterol the way the hypothesis predicted. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the body that sets U.S. national dietary policy, removed dietary cholesterol limits for the first time in decades. They explicitly stated there was no appreciable relationship between consumption of dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol in the general population. That was the committee admitting the guidance had been wrong, not subtly, not with caveats. Just wrong. But by then, an entire generation had grown up separating eggs. The ritual had become so normal that even after the science changed, the behavior didn't. People kept ordering egg white omelets, kept buying cartons of separated egg whites, kept throwing away yolks because it felt safer, even though the reason for doing it had been withdrawn. Let's talk about what's actually in that yolk. It contains choline, an essential nutrient critical for brain development, liver function, and neurotransmitter synthesis. Approximately 90% of Americans consume insufficient choline. The yolk is one of the richest dietary sources of it. The yolk also carries all of the egg's fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. The white alone contains none of these. The yolk contains lutein and zeaxanthin, carotenoids linked to reduced risk of macular degeneration, the leading cause of blindness in older adults. The white contains approximately 17 calories and 3.5 grams of protein. The whole egg delivers 78 calories, 6 grams of protein, and the complete micronutrient profile. You spent decades committing nutritional crimes against breakfast, throwing away the vitamins, throwing away the flavor, eating a rubbery disk of anxiety and calling it health. The yolk became a symbol because symbols are easier to manage than complexity. It's easier to say avoid the yolk than to say cholesterol metabolism is individualized. Dietary cholesterol has a modest effect on blood cholesterol for most people, and saturated fat intake, trans fat intake, and overall dietary pattern matter more than any single food. That's accurate, but it doesn't fit on a pamphlet. It doesn't give you a clear action. It doesn't let you feel like you're in control. So the yolk became the action. Remove it, and you've done something. You've made a choice. You've protected yourself. The symbol let you feel effective even when the action was pointless. Here's what makes this object worth lingering on. The egg yolk didn't just represent cholesterol, it represented fear. Fear of your own body, fear of invisible threats. Fear that eating the wrong thing, even once, could set a process in motion that would kill you decades later. That fear was maintained by repetition, by doctors who repeated guidelines they trusted, by nutritionists who learned the cholesterol hypothesis in school and never saw the update, by restaurant menus that offered egg white options as the default healthy choice, by people around you who ordered that way, reinforcing the idea that this was what informed people did. The yolk also represented pleasure. It's where the flavor is, the richness, the color. The satisfaction of breaking it with your fork and watching it run across the plate. Removing it wasn't just a nutritional decision, it was a removal of joy from the meal. And that removal felt virtuous, because somewhere along the way, you'd learned that if food tasted too good, it was probably hurting you. The egg yolk is just one object, but it's a perfect example of how a piece of food can become a symbol, and how that symbol can govern behavior long after the science that created it has moved on. You can eat the yolk now. The guidelines say so, the research supports it, but I'd bet some of you still hesitate, still feel a flicker of guilt, still hear a voice in the back of your head saying maybe you shouldn't. That voice isn't yours. It's the echo of a symbol that was never real. There were two conversations happening about food in the 1980s. One of them was for people who had the time, money, and access to worry about fat content. The other was for people trying to afford enough food to get through the week. The low-fat movement lived almost entirely in the first conversation. If you could afford to stand in a grocery store reading labels, comparing products, choosing the more expensive low-fat version because it promised better health, you were participating in a form of economic signaling that had nothing to do with nutrition. You were announcing through your cart that you had margin to care, margin to spend, margin to optimize. If you were shopping with food stamps, working 2 jobs, feeding children on a budget so tight that every dollar mattered, you weren't reading labels, you were reading prices. And the cheapest calories available were the ones the low-fat movement told you to avoid. White bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, sugar. The staples that filled stomachs and cost almost nothing. The low-fat ideology created a moral division between people who could afford to follow it and people who couldn't. It reframed poverty as a failure of personal responsibility. If you were eating the cheap, filling, carbohydrate-dense foods that kept you fed, you were making bad choices. You were eating poorly. You were failing at health. Never mind that the low-fat alternatives cost more. Never mind that fresh produce, lean meats, and specialty low-fat products required access to stores that didn't exist in every neighborhood. Never mind that cooking from scratch required time, knowledge, and a kitchen setup that not everyone had. The advice was universal, which meant anyone not following it was personally at fault. Let me show you what this looked like in practice. A single mother working 2 jobs comes home at 8 in the evening. Her children need to eat. She has 20 minutes before she has to get them to bed so they're rested for school. She opens the freezer and pulls out something fast. Chicken nuggets, fish sticks, a frozen pizza. The box says low fat, so she feels like she's doing something right, even though the product is mostly refined flour, sodium, and preservatives. She doesn't have time to roast vegetables. She doesn't have the energy to prepare a separate protein. She's doing the best she can with the tools available, and the tools available are designed to be fast, cheap, and shelf-stable. Nutrition is a luxury she can't afford to prioritize when the immediate need is just getting food into her children before the day ends. Meanwhile, in a different neighborhood, someone is attending a weekend seminar on heart-healthy eating. They're learning about omega-3 fatty acids, the benefits of wild-caught salmon, the importance of organic greens. They're taking notes. They're asking questions. They're planning their next grocery trip around these principles because they have the time to plan, the money to execute, and the belief that this effort will pay off in the form of a longer, healthier life. Both of these people are trying to feed themselves and their families, but only one of them will be praised for it. Only one of them will be seen as responsible, informed, and health-conscious. The other will be invisible, or worse, judged. The 8 glasses of water rule carried a similar divide. If you worked in an office, you could keep a water bottle at your desk. You could refill it throughout the day. You could take bathroom breaks whenever you needed them. Hydration was easy. If you worked in a factory, in construction, in retail, in any job where breaks were limited and bathroom access was controlled, drinking 8 glasses of water wasn't a health habit. It was a logistical problem. You couldn't leave your station. You couldn't interrupt the line. You couldn't take an unscheduled break just because you needed to use the restroom. So you drank less. And then you internalized the message that you weren't taking care of yourself, that you were failing at something basic, that everyone else seemed to manage just fine. The breakfast mandate had a class dimension too. If you had a stable morning routine, if you woke up with enough time to sit down and eat, if you had access to a kitchen and food waiting in the refrigerator, eating breakfast was easy. It was normal. It was what responsible people did. If you were rushing to catch a bus, if you were getting children ready for school while also getting yourself ready for work, if your shift started early and you barely had time to grab coffee, breakfast was a luxury. Skipping it wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. And the cultural message told you that this necessity was damaging your body, harming your children, setting everyone up for failure. The advice never acknowledged that the ability to follow it was conditional. It assumed everyone had the same resources, the same schedule, the same access. And when people couldn't follow it, the advice didn't adjust. It just blamed them. Here's the part that makes this division even sharper. The people giving the advice, the institutions writing the guidelines, the researchers conducting the studies, they were almost entirely from the group that could afford to follow the recommendations. They studied populations like themselves. They wrote for audiences like themselves. And they assumed their circumstances were universal. The result was a set of nutritional guidelines that worked beautifully for people with time and money, and failed completely for everyone else. And when those guidelines didn't produce the promised results at the population level, when obesity rates kept climbing and chronic disease kept spreading, the explanation offered was that people simply weren't trying hard enough. Not that the guidelines were inaccessible, not that the food system was built to make cheap calories nutrient-poor and expensive calories nutrient-dense, not that following the advice required resources most people didn't have, just that people weren't listening, weren't disciplined, weren't motivated. The hidden social divide wasn't just about who could afford low-fat yogurt. It was about who got to feel virtuous and who got to feel like a failure. And that divide was built into the advice from the beginning. Here is the biggest truth correction in a century of nutrition advice, and it's not a small one. It's not a footnote. It's not a minor recalibration. It's the kind of revelation that, once you understand it properly, changes the way you see almost every food rule you've ever been given. Sugar was the problem, and for 30 years the sugar industry paid scientists to make sure you were looking at fat instead. Let me say that again slowly, because it sounds like a conspiracy theory and it isn't one. It's a documented historical fact with a paper trail that was uncovered by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco in 2016, published in JAMA Internal Medicine, one of the most respected medical journals in the world. The documents they found were internal sugar industry communications from the 1960s. And what those documents showed was systematic, deliberate, and effective. In 1964, the Sugar Research Foundation, the lobbying and research arm of the American sugar industry, became aware of emerging research linking sugar consumption to coronary heart disease. They responded not by engaging with the science, but by funding a different science. They paid researchers at Harvard, including Dr. Frederick Stare and Dr. Mark Hegsted, to publish a literature review in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967 that specifically downplayed the link between sugar and heart disease, while emphasizing the link between dietary fat and heart disease. The review was presented as independent academic research. The funding was not disclosed. The New England Journal of Medicine did not require financial disclosure at the time, and the review was enormously influential. It helped establish the scientific foundation for decades of dietary guidance that told you fat was the problem, while sugar sat quietly in the background, adding itself to nearly everything you ate. Dr. Hegsted went on to become the head of nutrition at the United States Department of Agriculture, where he helped draft the 1977 dietary guidelines that officially launched the low-fat era. The man whose Harvard research was secretly funded by the sugar industry went on to write the government guidelines that shaped what an entire generation ate. This is not speculation. The documents exist. The payments exist. The correspondence exists. The researchers involved are named. The amounts paid are recorded. Approximately $6,500 in 1964, which is roughly $50,000 in today's money, was sufficient to redirect the scientific narrative around diet and heart disease for 3 decades. The JAMA paper described the effort as, and I'm paraphrasing closely here, an early example of the food industry attempting to influence nutrition science in ways that have lasting implications for public health. That's the polite academic way of saying that the sugar industry bought the science that blamed fat instead of them, and it worked better than anyone could have predicted. While dietary fat was being vilified, per capita sugar consumption in the United States was rising. The food industry, now free to replace fat with sugar to maintain palatability in low-fat products, had every commercial incentive to keep the fat hypothesis alive. The guidelines kept the pressure on fat. The sugar content of the food supply kept climbing. And the obesity and metabolic disease rates kept rising in the exact pattern you'd expect if sugar, not fat, was the primary driver. Now let's be careful here, because good history requires precision. This is not to say that all dietary fat is neutral, or that saturated fat has no cardiovascular implications whatsoever. Those questions are genuinely complex and still being studied. What this is saying is that the scientific conversation was systematically distorted at a critical moment by a funded intervention, and the distortion had consequences that lasted decades. The people writing your dietary guidelines were working with a corrupted evidence base and didn't know it. Some of them were part of the corruption. Most of them weren't. They were researchers and policymakers who trusted the peer-reviewed literature, which is exactly what you're supposed to do, without knowing that a portion of that literature had been manufactured to serve a commercial interest. And the people following those guidelines, buying the low-fat products, throwing away the egg yolks, switching from butter to margarine, all of them were doing exactly what they were told, by their doctors, by their governments, by the scientific community. They were being responsible. The misconception wasn't just that fat was the villain. The misconception was that the advice you were receiving was neutral, that the institutions producing it had no interests beyond your health, that science existed in a clean space where money couldn't reach. It doesn't. It never did. And understanding that doesn't mean you stop trusting science. It means you start understanding science as a human process, conducted by humans with funding sources and pressures and institutional relationships that can bend the output without breaking the method. It means you learn to ask not just what the study found, but who paid for it, not as a reflex of cynicism, but as a basic requirement of critical thinking. The sugar revelation broke something important open. It showed that the biggest nutritional mistake of the 20th century wasn't ignorance, it was influence. And the influence was so effective that you're still living inside its consequences right now. Every time you feel guilty about butter, every time you reach for the low-fat option, every time you assume the label telling you something is healthy represents a claim that earned its place there. 60 years after those payments were made, you're still sorting through the debris. The sugar industry invested $6,500. The return on that investment was 3 decades of misdirected public health policy, a reformulated food supply full of refined sugar, and a generation of people who blamed themselves for outcomes that were engineered without their knowledge. That's the biggest misconception break. Not a dietary rule you got slightly wrong. A fundamental corruption of the information system you were trusting with your health. And knowing it doesn't fix everything, but it changes the way you ask the next question. Which is the most important thing it can do. There's something deeply human about the way we eat. Not just the food itself, but the rituals around it. The morning coffee before anyone else wakes up. The specific bowl you use for cereal. The way your family always did Sunday dinner at a particular time with particular foods in a particular order. The habits that feel so fundamental to who you are that disrupting them feels like losing something important. These rituals matter. They've always mattered. And the food industry understood this long before nutritional science caught up with it. Kellogg's understood it when they told you breakfast was sacred. They weren't just selling cereal. They were selling a morning ritual. The specific sequence of waking, pouring, eating before the day began. They gave the routine a moral weight it had never had before, and then they positioned their product as the rightful centerpiece of that routine. The 8 glasses of water rule became a ritual too. People bought specific glasses, filled specific bottles, marked their intake on charts, set phone reminders to drink at regular intervals. The ritual was the point. It gave structure. It gave a measurable, completable daily task. It made health feel like something you could actually finish, which is enormously appealing when so much of health is invisible and ongoing. Let's sit with this for a moment because it's worth understanding. Human beings have always organized eating around ritual, long before there were nutritional guidelines, before there were food labels, before there were studies or guidelines or recommended daily allowances. People were eating in patterns. Seasonal patterns, daily patterns. Social patterns tied to family, to community, to the rhythms of agricultural life. You ate when the sun rose and when it set. You ate what was available in the season you were living in. You ate together, around a shared surface, with specific customs governing who served and who received and what the meal meant. The ritual of eating was inseparable from the ritual of living, and both were inseparable from the communities that gave them shape. The industrial food system didn't destroy these rituals. It co-opted them. It looked at the deeply human need for structured, meaningful eating practices, and it said, we can sell that. We can build products around that need. We can make ourselves the center of rituals that people already want to perform. The morning cereal ritual was one of the most successful examples. But it wasn't the only one. Think about the post-workout protein shake. The specific timing, the particular order of events. You finish your last set. You walk to your bag. You shake the bottle. You drink it within 30 minutes. The ritual feels scientific. It feels disciplined. It feels like part of the work. And the supplement industry built a product category specifically around that feeling, around the human need to have a completable post-effort ritual that signals recovery. Think about the nightly cup of warm milk before bed, the specific temperature, the specific quietness of the moment. The ritual signals to your body and your mind that the day is ending, that rest is coming, that the world is getting smaller and softer. The ritual works, not primarily because of the tryptophan content, as we'll get into later, but because ritual itself has a physiological effect. It lowers cortisol. It reduces arousal. It triggers conditioned responses in your nervous system that you've built up over years of repetition. Repetition is the mechanism. Every time you perform the same sequence before sleep, before meals, before a workout, you're training your nervous system to associate that sequence with what follows. The ritual becomes a cue, the cue becomes automatic, and the automatic behavior is the most powerful behavior of all, because it doesn't require decision-making energy, it just happens. This is why food myths are so durable. They don't just live in your intellect, they live in your habits. The low-fat rule wasn't just a belief. It was a behavior you performed dozens of times a day, every time you chose the low-fat version, every time you read a label and felt reassured by the number, every time you said no to something that felt indulgent. Those behaviors were woven into your daily rhythm. And changing a daily rhythm requires more than changing a belief. It requires dismantling and rebuilding something that runs mostly on autopilot. There's a beautiful and slightly melancholy truth here. The rituals you built around food myths weren't pointless. The act of caring about what you ate, of paying attention, of making deliberate choices, those things have value independent of whether the specific rule you were following was accurate. The discipline was real. The intention was real. The ritual had meaning even when the science behind it didn't. But you can keep the ritual without keeping the myth. You can still have your morning routine, your post-workout practice, your evening wind down, your Sunday dinner tradition. You can do all of that without it being organized around rules that were written to sell you something. The most powerful eating rituals in human history weren't built around products. They were built around seasons, around community, around the simple recurring fact of shared hunger and shared food, around the table as a place where people sat together, and that fact alone was worth something. Somewhere in the machinery of the modern food industry, that got complicated. The rituals got hijacked and the products moved in, but the underlying human need, the need to eat in a way that feels intentional, connected, and meaningful, that never changed. It was always there, it just got very expensive to ignore. Your body knows things your brain doesn't have words for yet. It knows when something is wrong before you can name it. It knows when it's cold before you've consciously registered the temperature drop. It knows when it's hungry in ways that go far beyond the stomach growling, in a low-level restlessness, in difficulty concentrating, in a particular kind of irritability that food will fix and nothing else will. This intelligence is old, older than language, older than agriculture, older than the concept of nutrition itself. Your body evolved to survive in conditions where food was never guaranteed, where eating well today was preparation for not eating at all tomorrow, where every meal was a hedge against an uncertain future. And then the modern food environment arrived, one characterized not by scarcity but by relentless abundance. By engineered food specifically designed to override the signals your body sends. By hyper-palatable combinations of fat, salt, and sugar calibrated to be more rewarding than anything your evolutionary history prepared you for. The mismatch between your ancient biology and your modern environment is where most of the confusion lives. Your body was never designed to navigate a grocery store. It was designed to navigate a landscape where food required effort to find, where sweet meant ripe fruit and not high-fructose corn syrup, where fat was rare and therefore precious, where salt was so scarce that craving it had genuine survival value. Let me take you back much further now. Before grocery stores, before processed food, before agricultural civilization, into a world where the human relationship with food was immediate, physical, and entirely without the layer of ideology we've placed over it. A person hunting or gathering in a pre-agricultural landscape doesn't have dietary guidelines. They have hunger, experience, and access. They eat what's available, what won't make them sick, what their community has learned across generations is safe. Their food knowledge is practical, embodied, earned through contact with the actual plants and animals around them. Not through labels, not through studies, through eating and watching what happens. Their relationship with fat is not guilty. Fat is survival. An animal with significant fat deposits is a remarkable find, because the fat will sustain the group longer than lean meat will. The caloric density of fat, 9 calories per gram versus 4 for protein, is not a fact from a nutrition textbook. It's a felt reality in a body that knows what it feels like to run on adequate fuel and what it feels like to run on not enough. Their relationship with sugar is not complicated. Sweet things are ripe things. Ripe things are safe things. The instinct to seek sweetness guided people toward fruit at peak nutritional value, toward honey that represented an extraordinary caloric windfall, toward the natural sugars in root vegetables that provided accessible energy. The reward circuitry that makes sweetness pleasurable was adaptive. It directed behavior toward foods the body needed. None of this prepared the human body for industrial food, for strawberry-flavored corn syrup in a drink that contains no strawberries, for fat and salt and sugar combined in proportions that exist nowhere in nature, for the experience of eating something engineered to be maximally rewarding while delivering minimal nutrition, something that hits every evolutionary signal for quality while providing almost nothing of actual value. The fear response around food developed alongside this mismatch, not just the cultural fear of eating the wrong thing, but a deeper biological anxiety. When your blood sugar spikes and crashes from refined carbohydrates, your body reads the crash as an emergency. Cortisol rises. Hunger returns with urgency. The signal is eat now, not because you need nutrition, but because the blood glucose pattern looks like starvation to a system that can't distinguish between a sugar crash and genuine food shortage. When you follow the low-fat guidelines and eat a diet high in refined carbohydrates, You are putting yourself on a blood sugar roller coaster that your body interprets as a survival situation many times a day. Every spike is followed by a crash. Every crash triggers a stress response. Every stress response drives eating, and then you blame yourself for the eating because the guidelines told you that willpower was the missing variable. It wasn't willpower, it was physiology responding rationally to irrational inputs. The cholesterol fear operated differently. It was an abstract fear. You couldn't feel cholesterol accumulating. You couldn't feel a heart attack developing. The fear was mediated entirely through information, through numbers on a lab report, through guidelines telling you what those numbers meant and what they would eventually lead to. That abstract fear was just as powerful as the immediate biological fear of hunger, maybe more powerful, because it was always present and never satisfied. There was no moment at which you felt safe. The threat was invisible and perpetual. Chronic anxiety about food has measurable physiological consequences. Cortisol elevation from persistent stress promotes fat storage, particularly visceral fat around the abdomen. It disrupts sleep architecture, which raises hunger hormones the following day. It compromises immune function. The fear of eating poorly, when it becomes constant, contributes to the same health problems it's trying to prevent. Your body was built for a world where food was sometimes scarce and always earned. It was built to navigate real hunger, real physical effort, real variation in intake based on what was available. It was not built for calorie counting, for label reading, for the chronic low-grade anxiety of a food environment that requires constant navigation. The single most disruptive thing the modern food ideology did to the human body wasn't any specific dietary recommendation. It was replacing physical, embodied, sensory knowledge of food with an abstract, rule-based system of fear and compliance. It made eating cognitive when it was always meant to be instinctual. It made food a moral problem when it was always a biological one. Your hunger is information. Your fullness is information. Your cravings, while often exploited by an industry that knows how to trigger them, contain signals worth listening to. The body asking for protein feels different from the body asking for energy. The body asking for rest feels different from the body asking for food. These distinctions are learnable, accessible, free. They were always there. We just built so many rules on top of them that they got hard to hear. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how things were made, it changed how people ate. And the change happened so gradually, so thoroughly, that by the time anyone thought to question it, the new way of eating had already been renamed tradition. Before industrialization, food was local almost by definition, not as a philosophy, not as a lifestyle choice, as a physical reality. You ate what grew near you. You ate what your neighbors raised. You ate what the season allowed. A bad harvest wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis. The relationship between people and their food was immediate, in a way that's almost impossible to recreate now, because you knew exactly where every ingredient came from, because in many cases you had watched it grow. The mill was the center of the grain economy in most agricultural communities. The miller knew every farmer who brought grain to be ground. The baker knew the miller. The family buying bread knew the baker. The chain between field and table was short enough to walk, and every person in that chain had skin in the game, because their reputation, their livelihood, and their community relationships were all attached to the quality of what they produced. Then the railroads arrived, and with the railroads came the ability to move food across distances that would have been unimaginable to anyone living in an agricultural village 50 years earlier. Suddenly, grain grown in the American Midwest could feed people in New York City. Cattle raised in Texas could be slaughtered in Chicago and shipped refrigerated to the East Coast. The geographic relationship between production and consumption was severed, and it has never been fully restored. What the railroads started, the canning industry accelerated. In the early 19th century, canning was a military technology. Napoleon Bonaparte offered a prize in 1800 for a method of preserving food for his armies, and Nicholas Appert won it by sealing food in glass jars and heating them. The method spread, the technology improved. By the mid-19th century, tin cans were being produced at industrial scale, and food that would have spoiled within days could now last for years on a shelf. This was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in human history, food could be produced in one place, processed in another, shipped across continents, and consumed months or years later in a completely different climate. The seasonal constraints that had governed human eating for all of recorded history began to dissolve. Peaches in December, tomatoes in January, corn in the middle of winter in a city surrounded by snow. The abundance was real. The nutritional consequences were also real, even if they took longer to appear. Because what was lost in processing and shipping wasn't just freshness, it was the relationship between the food and the person eating it. The knowledge, the context, the understanding of where this thing came from and what it had been before it arrived in a can. Into this expanding food system walked the scientists, not with bad intentions, with genuine belief that the tools of chemistry and industrial production could improve on nature. That food could be made safer, more consistent, more nutritious through processing. That removing the perishable, unstable components of food and replacing them with stable, measurable, quantifiable substitutes was progress. And some of it was. The iodization of salt in the 1920s genuinely eliminated widespread iodine deficiency and the thyroid disease that accompanied it. The fortification of flour, with B vitamins and iron after the Second World War, addressed real nutritional deficiencies in populations eating refined grain stripped of its nutrient-rich outer layers. These were legitimate public health achievements that deserve acknowledgement, but the same industrial logic that produced those achievements also produced something else: the gradual transformation of food from a biological reality into a chemical formulation. The idea that what mattered about food was its measurable components, its calories, its fat grams, its vitamin content per serving, and that these components could be removed, adjusted, replaced, and recombined to produce whatever outcome was currently considered healthy. This is the logic that produced margarine. The idea that a laboratory-engineered solid fat was superior to butter because it came from vegetable sources rather than animal ones. It's the logic that produced fat-free everything. The idea that removing the fat and replacing it with sugar was an improvement because fat had more calories per gram, and calories were now the primary unit of measurement. It's the logic that produced fortified breakfast cereals, the idea that you could strip whole grains of their fiber, germ, and natural nutrient content, refine them into a shelf-stable sugar delivery vehicle, and then add back synthetic vitamins and call the result nutritious. Cornflakes with added iron and B vitamins. Nutritionally, a different thing entirely from whole corn. But the label says fortified, and fortified sounds like an improvement. The global spread of the Western diet through the 20th century followed the same pattern. American food companies, armed with industrial production capacity, global logistics networks, and enormous advertising budgets, moved into markets around the world and brought their products with them. Soft drinks arrived in places that had never had a dental crisis and created one within a generation. Refined flour displaced traditional grains that had sustained populations for centuries. Fast food franchises appeared in cities where people had been eating fresh, whole, locally produced food for generations. The colonialism of food is a real and documented phenomenon. Not just the physical imposition of one culture's eating habits on another, but the deeper ideological imposition of the belief that industrial food was modern, progressive, and superior, while traditional food practices were primitive, inefficient, and in need of replacement. In many cases, the traditional food practices were nutritionally superior by almost every measurable standard. The traditional Japanese diet, heavy in fish, fermented foods, vegetables, and rice, was associated with some of the longest life expectancies in the world before Western dietary patterns began their influence. The traditional Mediterranean diet, built on olive oil, legumes, whole grains, vegetables, and modest amounts of animal protein, showed cardiovascular outcomes that researchers in the mid-20th century found genuinely puzzling because they didn't fit the fat hypothesis. The traditional diets of many indigenous communities, built on the specific plants, animals, and preparation methods of their particular ecosystems, were sophisticated nutritional systems developed over thousands of years of lived experimentation. These systems were not perfect, no food system is, but they were embedded in ecological reality, in seasonal availability, in community knowledge passed down through direct experience. They were built by people who paid the price for getting it wrong. The industrial food system was built by people whose primary metric was profit, and who paid scientists to validate whatever they were already producing. The difference in incentive structure matters enormously when you're trying to evaluate whose food advice is trustworthy. By the end of the 20th century, the transformation was nearly complete in most developed nations. The majority of calories consumed in the United States came from ultra-processed foods, a category that didn't exist 100 years earlier. The food landscape had been so thoroughly restructured that whole foods, things that grew out of the ground or walked on it and required minimal preparation, were now the specialty items. The things that required a factory to produce were the default. And sitting on top of all of this was an industry of nutritional advice telling you how to navigate the very landscape it had helped create. Buy this product instead of that one. Choose this label over that one. Follow these guidelines and you'll be fine. The guidelines were written inside the system. They couldn't fully see the system. And the people following them couldn't see it either, because they were inside it too, buying their groceries in stores that had been built to sell them a particular kind of food and a particular kind of health. The world changed around food before food had a chance to change with it, and most people eating today are eating inside consequences that were set in motion long before they were born. Let me tell you about the version of nutrition history that most people actually know. The one they got from morning television, from wellness bloggers, from the documentary their friend wouldn't stop talking about, from the Instagram account with the clean white aesthetic and the confident captions, from the school curriculum that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. It's not entirely wrong, but it's curated in a way that serves specific interests, and the curation is so smooth you rarely notice it happening. The food pyramid is a good place to start, because almost everyone over a certain age learned nutrition from it, and almost no one knows how it was actually produced. The USDA food pyramid, introduced in 1992, placed grains at the base, the largest section, as the foundation of a healthy diet. 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta per day was the recommendation. The original design proposed by USDA nutritionists in 1991 was different. It placed fats and sweets at the top in a small triangle as expected, but it also distinguished between different types of fat, acknowledged the health value of certain proteins, and presented a more nuanced picture of carbohydrate consumption. The grain and sugar industries objected to the original design. They lobbied the USDA. The pyramid was delayed, revised, and when it finally appeared, the most commercially inconvenient distinctions had been softened. The result was a government-issued nutritional graphic that told every American child to eat up to 11 servings of refined grain per day as the foundation of healthy eating. This graphic was reproduced in textbooks, on cafeteria walls, in educational materials distributed to millions of households. It was presented as science. It was partly an industry compromise. The internet era didn't fix this. It multiplied it. The wellness industry found in social media a distribution mechanism of unprecedented reach and zero editorial accountability. Claims that would have been rejected by any responsible publisher in 1990 could now reach millions of people by tomorrow morning if the visual was clean enough and the caption was confident enough. The detox industry lives almost entirely in this space. Cleanses, liver flushes, colon cleanses, heavy metal detox protocols, lymphatic drainage supplements, all of them marketed through aspirational imagery, testimonials, and language designed to sound scientific without being falsifiable. Words like toxins, cleanse, flush, reset, purify. None of these terms have regulatory definitions. None of them trigger the scrutiny that a pharmaceutical claim would require. They exist in a space specifically engineered to be unaccountable. The clean eating movement, which began with genuinely reasonable ideas about whole foods and minimal processing, mutated through social media into something much more rigid and much more profitable. It developed a language of purity and contamination that mapped almost perfectly onto disordered eating patterns, where certain foods were classified as clean and others as dirty, where eating the wrong thing was a moral failure, where the goal was an increasingly narrow definition of acceptable consumption that required more and more products to achieve. Those products were waiting. The wellness industry had anticipated the market perfectly. If you convinced people that their default food environment was toxic and that purity required effort, expense, and specific purchased items, you had created a customer who would pay premium prices indefinitely and feel virtuous doing it. The documentary as a nutritional authority deserves its own examination. Several influential food documentaries of the past 2 decades have shaped public understanding of nutrition more profoundly than any peer-reviewed publication of the same period. They're watchable. They're emotionally compelling. They tell clear stories with heroes and villains, and they present cherry-picked evidence with the confidence of settled science. What I'm missing is the counter-evidence, the studies that don't support the thesis, the experts who disagree. The ways in which the data presented is incomplete or selectively interpreted. Documentaries don't have peer review. They have editors with theses to support, and the thesis almost always involves a product, a movement, a diet, or an ideology that benefits someone financially. This isn't unique to food. Every field has its documentary problem, but food documentaries have produced some of the most dramatic and durable misconceptions in contemporary nutritional culture. The belief that all processed food is equally harmful. The belief that certain single foods possess near pharmaceutical power to prevent or reverse disease. The belief that conventional medicine is engaged in a systematic conspiracy to suppress nutritional cures for chronic illness. The school curriculum problem is quieter but arguably more consequential, because it reaches everyone at the age when beliefs are most easily cemented. The nutritional education most adults received was based on guidelines that were already decades old when they were taught, and those guidelines have since been substantially revised. But the revision doesn't travel backwards into the memories of people who learned the old version in a classroom. You learn the food pyramid, you learn that fat is bad, you learn that breakfast is essential, and 8 glasses of water is the requirement, and that certain foods are inherently dangerous, and others are inherently virtuous. You learned all of this before you had the critical thinking tools to question it. And then it became the baseline you measured everything else against. Tourism and cultural branding have added their own layer of distortion. The Mediterranean diet as it exists in clinical research is a specific, carefully documented dietary pattern drawn from epidemiological studies of mid-20th century Greek and Italian populations. The Mediterranean diet as it exists in popular culture is a loosely defined aesthetic involving olive oil, pasta, red wine, and a general sense of relaxed European sophistication. These are not the same thing. The clinical version includes specific proportions of specific foods eaten in specific patterns over a lifetime. The cultural version is a marketing category that allows almost any product containing olive oil to position itself as heart-healthy by association. French women don't get fat. This phrase, the title of a best-selling book, rests on the French paradox, which rests on data that has been substantially reanalyzed and found to be far more complicated than the original observation suggested. The French population health statistics that made the paradox seem paradoxical were partly a function of how food consumption and cause of death were recorded differently in France than in other countries studied. The paradox may have been partly a measurement artifact. But the book sold millions of copies and convinced an entire readership that there was a specific, learnable French approach to eating that could be bottled and followed. The truth about food is almost never as clean as the story being sold about it. And the cleaner the story, the more suspicious you should probably be. Clean stories serve someone. Complicated truths usually don't. Here's the question worth sitting with. If so much of what we've covered tonight is demonstrably wrong, why did any of it survive? Why are people still following the 8-glass rule? Why are egg yolks still avoided by millions of people? Why does the organic premium persist? Why does the detox industry grow every year? Why do the myths outlive the corrections? The answer has almost nothing to do with intelligence. Intelligent people follow these rules too. It has everything to do with the specific conditions that allow a belief to outlast the evidence against it. The first condition is identity. When a food rule becomes part of how you see yourself, it stops being a belief and starts being a characteristic. If eating organic is part of how you signal that you care about your health, your environment, and your values, then evidence that organic produce isn't nutritionally superior isn't just a factual correction, it's a threat to a self-concept. And self-concepts are defended with far more energy than beliefs are. The second condition is social reinforcement. If everyone around you follows the same rule, the rule feels true regardless of its accuracy. When the people you trust, your friends, your doctor, your parents, your community, all agree that something is dangerous or beneficial, the consensus feels like evidence. Disagreeing with it requires not just changing a belief, but accepting a kind of social isolation, the experience of being the person who thinks differently from everyone else in the room. This is not a weakness. It's a deeply functional social adaptation. Humans are group animals. We survived by coordinating with each other, by sharing information and following the consensus of people we trusted. The problem is that this same mechanism that made us good at surviving pre-industrial life makes us very susceptible to information environments where the consensus is manufactured. When the sugar industry funded the science that blamed fat, they weren't just influencing a study, they were reshaping the consensus. And once the consensus was reshaped, every social reinforcement mechanism in human psychology worked to maintain it. The third condition is the comfort of certainty. Rules are comforting, even wrong rules. A world in which you know exactly what to eat and what to avoid is easier to navigate than a world in which the answer to almost every nutritional question is, "It depends." The 8-glass rule is comforting because it's specific. Follow it, check it off, feel done. The real answer about hydration, which is drink when you're thirsty, adjust for activity and climate, trust your kidneys, is accurate but unsatisfying. It doesn't give you anything to do. It doesn't let you feel like you're completing a health task. Industries understand this. They build products and rules around the human need for specific, completable actions. Take this supplement every morning. Drink this many glasses. Avoid these specific foods. The specificity is the product, not the health outcome. The fourth condition is the commercial machinery behind the myths. Beliefs that generate revenue have advocates with resources. The supplement industry has marketing budgets. The organic food industry has marketing budgets. The detox industry has marketing budgets. These budgets fund more content, more reach, more repetition of the belief. The correction, which usually comes from academic researchers with no marketing budget and no commercial interest, competes against this machinery with peer-reviewed papers that most people will never read and press releases that generate one news cycle before disappearing. The fifth condition, and maybe the most important one, is genuine partial truth. Very few food myths are entirely wrong. Fat can contribute to excess caloric intake in certain dietary contexts. Breakfast does benefit certain populations. Hydration genuinely matters. Carrots do contain beta-carotene that supports vision in deficient individuals. Dietary cholesterol does affect blood cholesterol in some people. Organic farming does produce lower pesticide residues. The partial truths are real. They're the seed around which the myth grew. And they make the myth much harder to fully uproot. Because every time you try to correct it, you have to explain not just where it went wrong, but where it originally came from, and what it got right on the way. Beliefs survive when they serve people, when they provide identity, community, certainty, comfort, or revenue. When they contain enough truth to make the complete correction feel like splitting hairs, when they're defended by people with the resources to keep repeating them. The food myths we've been through tonight survived not because they were true, but because they were useful. Useful to the industries that spread them, useful to the people who needed something to believe, useful to institutions that needed simple rules to give to complicated populations. The question now is not just which myths to abandon, but what to replace them with. Because you still need to eat. You still need to make decisions about food every single day. And a vacuum where a belief used to be is uncomfortable enough that most people will fill it with the next available belief, whether it's better or not. The replacement doesn't have to be a new system. It doesn't have to be a new set of rules. It can be simpler than that. It can be the return of something that was there before the rules arrived. The capacity to eat in a way that responds to your body, your circumstances, your culture, your season, your hunger, without ideology, without guilt, without the weight of a story that was never really yours to carry. That's what survives when the myths don't. The simple, old, very human act of feeding yourself. Let's zoom out now, all the way out. Past the specific myths, past the industry documents, past the dietary guidelines and the food pyramids and the cereal company slogans. Past all of it, to the view from a very great height, where you can see not just what happened but why it keeps happening. Why humans are so reliably, so persistently, so vulnerably attached to stories about food. Food has never been just fuel, not for a single day in all of human history. From the moment our ancestors gathered around a fire and shared what they had found or killed or grown, Food has been the primary language through which humans communicated belonging, care, status, identity, fear, love, grief, celebration. The meal was never just calories, it was always meaning. Think about the foods tied to your earliest memories of being loved, not the nutritional profile of those foods, not their fat content or their glycemic index. The smell, the specific warmth of a particular dish in a particular kitchen in a particular season of your life, your grandmother's cooking. The food that appeared when you were sick, the meal that meant a celebration was happening. These memories don't live in the rational part of your brain. They live somewhere older and deeper than that, in the place where safety and comfort and belonging are stored. This is not a weakness. This is one of the most beautiful things about being human. We made meaning out of eating. We turned a biological necessity into a cultural art form. We built entire civilizations around the sharing of food, entire religions around which foods were sacred and which were forbidden, entire social structures around who ate what and with whom and in what order. The problem is not that we gave food meaning. The problem is that the industrial food system and the nutritional ideology built around it found a way to exploit that meaning while simultaneously stripping it away. Here's what I mean. The low-fat movement told you that food was primarily a delivery system for macronutrients, and those macronutrients were either safe or dangerous. The detox industry told you that food was something your body needed to recover from. The calorie-counting culture told you that food was a mathematical equation to be managed. The clean eating movement told you that food was a moral test you were either passing or failing. Every one of these frameworks took something that was rich and complex and human and reduced it to a single anxious question. Is this okay? Every bite carrying a verdict. Every meal a test. Every pleasure requiring justification. And in doing this, the food ideology severed the connection between people and their own bodies. It replaced the ancient embodied knowledge of hunger and fullness and satisfaction and seasonal availability with an external rulebook. It told you that you couldn't trust your own instincts. That without the guidelines, without the labels, without the expert advice, you would make dangerous mistakes. You needed to be managed, and there was always someone ready to manage you, for a price. What this reveals about humans is not that we're gullible. It's that we're trusting, and there's a difference worth holding on to. Gullibility is a failure of intelligence. Trust is a social necessity. You cannot build a community, a family, a civilization without the capacity to trust what other people tell you. The people who followed the dietary guidelines weren't foolish. They were doing exactly what cooperative social animals are supposed to do. They were listening to the authorities their community had established and following the consensus those authorities produced. The exploitation of that trust is not the fault of the people who trusted. It's the failure of the institutions that were trusted and chose profit over accuracy. But here's the deeper truth, the one that sits underneath all of this and doesn't get said enough. Every single food myth we've covered tonight was built on a real human fear. The fear of heart disease. The fear of cancer. The fear of aging poorly. Of being a burden. Of watching your body fail before your life is finished. The fear of not providing well enough for your children. The fear of doing something irreversible without knowing it. These fears are legitimate. They're not irrational. Heart disease is real. Cancer is real. The consequences of sustained poor nutrition are real. The fears that the food industry exploited were genuine fears, not manufactured ones. What was manufactured was the specific story about what caused them and what could prevent them. You were afraid of dying too soon. You were afraid of suffering. You were afraid of leaving your children without a parent, your partner without a companion, your community without your presence. And the food industry looked at those fears and said, "We have something that will help. Buy this, avoid that, follow these rules." And the fears made you receptive in a way that you might not have been if you were just being sold a product for its own sake. Fear is the most powerful marketing force in human psychology. Not because people are weak, but because fear is rational. It evolved to protect you. When something threatens your survival or the survival of the people you love, paying close attention to information about that threat is exactly the right response. The problem is that the information was corrupted. The threat was real. The proposed solution was commercial. Underneath the fear, though, there was always something else. Something that the food ideology tried to suppress but couldn't fully reach. The pleasure of eating. The simple, animal, irreducible satisfaction of food that tastes good and fills you up and shares a table with people you love. This pleasure survived. Even in the worst years of the low-fat era, when people were eating fat-free cookies that tasted like regret and rubbery egg-white omelets that satisfied nothing, the pleasure of eating was still there, just driven underground. Made guilty. Made secret. Made something you indulged in and then apologized for. And the guilt was the product. Not the food, the guilt. Because a person who feels guilty about eating will keep buying products that promise to relieve the guilt. They'll keep following the new plan, the cleaner protocol, the stricter guideline, because the guilt is always unresolved and the resolution is always available for purchase. The business model requires the guilt to persist. If you ever truly made peace with eating, if you ever genuinely trusted your body and your hunger and your pleasure, you would stop being a customer in the way the industry needs you to be. Here's the big human truth. We built culture around food because food is how we take care of each other. The meal offered to a grieving neighbor, the birthday cake, the harvest feast, the bread broken and shared between strangers. These acts of feeding and being fed are among the oldest and most fundamental expressions of human care that exist. They predate written language, they predate money, they predate governments and religions, and every institution that has since tried to colonize them. The food myths didn't just mislead you about nutrition, they interfered with something much older and more important. They made you afraid of the very act through which humans have expressed love and community since before we had words for either. And that's worth being a little angry about. Not a lot. Not the kind of anger that keeps you up at night, but the quiet, clarifying kind that helps you see what was taken and what can be reclaimed. What can be reclaimed is simple. The meal as connection, the table as community, hunger as information rather than enemy, pleasure as legitimate rather than suspect, the body as something to be listened to rather than managed, food as a relationship rather than a transaction. None of that requires a new system. None of it requires a product. It just requires putting down the rule book that was never written for you in the first place, and picking up the older, quieter knowledge that was always underneath it. The kitchen is quiet now. The grocery store is closed. The labels aren't readable in this light, and that's perfectly fine, because you don't need to read them right now. Right now, the only thing happening is the end of the day, and the slow, reliable movement of your body toward rest. Let the facts settle for a moment. Not the details, not the specific names and dates and studies, just the general shape of what you've learned tonight. That the rules were not always rules, that the certainty was not always earned, that your body, underneath all the ideology, was doing something ancient and intelligent and largely trustworthy all along. There's something quietly relieving about that, if you let yourself feel it. The possibility that you weren't doing it as wrong as you thought. That the guilt you carried about food was borrowed from a story that was never really about you. That the body you've spent years trying to manage through rules was, the whole time, managing itself with a sophistication no rulebook has ever fully captured. Think about the generations of people who ate without guidelines, not because they were reckless, but because the guidelines hadn't been invented yet. They ate what was available. They ate with the people around them. They ate in seasons. They had preferences and dislikes and specific foods that meant specific things on specific occasions. And they were, on the whole, no more lost than we are now. In many ways, considerably less so. The oldest human relationship with food was also the simplest one. Hunger leads to eating. Eating leads to satisfaction. Satisfaction leads to rest. The cycle is so basic it sounds almost too simple to be worth saying out loud. But somewhere in the last century of nutritional ideology, that cycle was interrupted, complicated, loaded with steps and conditions and caveats until the original simplicity became invisible under the weight of all the additions. You can let some of that weight down tonight. Not permanently, maybe, not all at once, but just for now, in this particular hour before sleep, you can set down the calorie count, the label anxiety, the guilt about whatever you ate today that you wish you hadn't, and the quiet performance of being someone who follows the rules. None of that needs to come to bed with you. The egg yolk is fine. The full-fat yogurt is fine. The butter on the bread is fine. And the bread is also fine. The glass of water you didn't drink at 3 in the afternoon doesn't represent a failure of self-care. The breakfast you skipped because you weren't hungry was your body telling you something accurate about what it needed. The late dinner was just a meal. There's a kind of freedom available in the space where a myth used to live. It doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives gradually, the way light does in the early morning, slowly enough that you don't notice it until the room is already different. The freedom of eating without a verdict attached. The freedom of hunger as a simple biological signal rather than a moral situation. Think about the people throughout history who ate together without knowing anything about macronutrients, who shared bread and oil and wine and fruit and meat and legumes and root vegetables prepared in the ways their grandmothers taught them, in kitchens that smelled of specific spices and specific seasons. They didn't know their omega-3 ratios. They didn't track their protein intake. They didn't feel guilty about the fat in the lamb or the sugar in the fruit or the salt in the olives. They just ate, and the eating was good. Not because the food was perfect by any measurable standard, but because the eating was embedded in life in a way that made it nourishing in every sense of the word, not just the biochemical one. That embeddedness is what the industrial food system couldn't replicate and the nutritional ideology couldn't replace. You can engineer a vitamin, you can fortify a cereal, you can add back what the processing removed, but you cannot manufacture the experience of eating something grown nearby, prepared by someone who loves you, shared at a table with people who matter. That experience is not a macronutrient. It's not on any label, and it's not available in any supplement. It's available in the way you always imagined it might be, in the actual meal, in the actual people, in the actual ordinary moment of food shared between humans who are trying their best to take care of each other. Let your breathing slow now. The information part of tonight is almost done. What remains is quieter than that. Your body is doing its work right now. Your liver is processing whatever you ate today, unhurriedly and competently. Your kidneys are managing your fluid balance with the precision of a system that has been doing this job for your entire life, without a single instruction from you. Your gut is moving things along at its own pace, populated by a community of microorganisms you've never met, but who are working steadily on your behalf in the dark. None of this requires your attention. None of it is improved by worry. The body you've been trying to manage through rules is managing itself through processes so complex and so interconnected that no dietary guideline has ever fully mapped them. And it's doing this right now, tonight, while you drift. The myths are quieter at this hour. The marketing is asleep. The labels aren't visible. And what's left is just you, and your body, and the old, uncomplicated truth that you were always more equipped for this than anyone told you. There's a kitchen somewhere in the 1950s where a woman is reading a pamphlet. The pamphlet says she needs 8 glasses of water a day. It says fat is dangerous. It says breakfast is essential. She reads it carefully, because she wants to do right by her family, because the institution that printed it has authority she trusts, because the information is specific, and the specificity feels like safety. She doesn't know what we know now. She doesn't know that the pamphlet is incomplete, that the second sentence about food containing water was dropped somewhere between the research and the printing, that the fat guidance will be partially reversed in her lifetime, that the breakfast claim came from a cereal factory before it came from any laboratory. She just knows she's trying, and her trying is real, even when the information guiding it isn't. The care is real. The love that made her read the pamphlet carefully, that made her want to get it right, that is real, and it matters, and it deserves to be honored rather than mocked. That's the thing about all the people who followed the food myths. The mother buying low-fat everything in the 1980s. The man separating his egg yolks through the 90s. The woman counting her water glasses and feeling anxious by afternoon. The person in the gym drinking a sports drink after a 45-minute walk because the label said it was for active people, and they wanted to be active people. All of them were trying. All of them were doing what the available information told them to do. All of them deserved better information than they got. And so do you. Not a new system. Not a new set of rules to replace the old ones. Not a product or a protocol or a 30-day program. Just better information, held lightly. With the understanding that nutrition science is genuinely incomplete, genuinely evolving, and genuinely complicated by the fact that the humans studying it live inside the same food environment and the same funding structures as everyone else. The best the evidence currently supports is something that would have been completely unsurprising to almost any human being alive before the 20th century. Eat mostly whole foods. Eat mostly plants. Eat with other people when you can. Eat what your particular body responds well to, which you'll know because you'll feel functional, satisfied, and neither hungry nor stuffed. Don't eat so much that you consistently feel bad. Don't eat so little that you consistently feel desperate. That's it. That's the distillation of everything, not because it's comprehensive or precise or scientifically rigorous enough to satisfy a nutritionist, but because it's what the evidence, stripped of commercial influence and ideological overlay, actually points toward. A pattern. A relationship. A way of eating that's flexible enough to be sustained across a lifetime and simple enough to be practiced without a rule book. The egg yolk is back on your plate now, if you want it. The butter is back. The full-fat yogurt is back. The coffee is back, and it counts as hydration. The late dinner is just dinner. The skipped breakfast was just a morning when you weren't hungry. The frozen vegetables in your freezer are probably more nutritious than the fresh ones that have been traveling for 2 weeks. And the guilt? The specific, persistent, commercially manufactured guilt that told you every food choice was a moral statement about who you are, that can go. Tonight, if you're ready. Or gradually, which is also fine. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry in a grocery store. You were never supposed to be carrying it in the first place. Someone handed it to you. Someone profited from it. And now you know enough to put it down. The myths we covered tonight will keep circulating. They're too embedded, too commercially useful, too socially reinforced to disappear quickly. You'll hear them from people you trust, from institutions that should know better, from labels and advertisements, and well-meaning relatives who are just repeating what they were told. You don't have to correct everyone. You don't have to carry this information like a weapon. You just have to know what you know. Hold it quietly, use it when it's useful, and let the rest of the noise settle into the background where it belongs. The woman in the 1950s kitchen is still there, reading her pamphlet by the light above the stove. She's doing her best. So are you. The difference is that you have more of the story now. You know where the pamphlet came from. You know what it got wrong and what it got right and what it was trying to do. You know that the institutions you trusted were sometimes trustworthy and sometimes not, and that telling the difference requires asking questions rather than assuming authority is accuracy. You know that your body was always doing something intelligent, even when the rules told you to override it. You know that the meal was always more than macronutrients. You know that the table was always more than a delivery mechanism for nutrition. You know that food has always been, at its most fundamental, a way of saying to the people around you that you see them, you care about them, and you're willing to sit with them for a while and share something that sustains you both. None of the myths could take that away. They tried to reduce it to numbers and labels and rules and fear, but underneath all of that, the meal remained. The table remained. The hunger and the satisfaction and the warmth of eating something good in the company of people you love, all of that remained. And it will remain tomorrow, and the meal after that. And the one after that? Your body knows what to do with the night. Your liver is working. Your kidneys are working. Your gut is working. Your brain is beginning the slow, necessary process of moving the day's information into longer-term storage, of consolidating what matters and releasing what doesn't. Let the facts from tonight find their places. Let the corrections land softly. Let the myths dissolve at whatever pace feels natural. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to emerge from this with a new protocol or a reformulated grocery list. You just need to carry forward the quieter knowledge underneath all the detail. That you were always more trustworthy than the rules implied. That your body was always more capable than the guidelines suggested. That the most nourishing thing about a meal was never primarily the food. The kitchen is dark now. The labels are unreadable. The grocery store is closed and the supplement aisle is quiet, and the cereal boxes are sitting on their shelves in the dark, with their bold health claims printed on the front, waiting for morning. You don't need to read them tonight. Tonight, there's just the end of the day, the slow movement toward sleep, the body doing its ancient, competent work in the dark, the breath settling, the thoughts softening at their edges, the weight of the day becoming something lighter. You ate today. It was enough. You always were. Sleep well.